The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.
Welcome to the ASCO in Action podcast. This is ASCO's monthly podcast series where we explore policy and practice issues that impact oncologists, the entire cancer care delivery, and, of course, the individuals we take care of, people with cancer. My name is Clifford Hudis, and I'm the CEO of ASCO. I serve as the host of this ASCO in Action podcast series, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ed Kim, who is the chair of the Department of Solid Tumor Oncology at the Levine Cancer Institute. He's here to discuss eligibility criteria for cancer clinical trials. Now, Dr. Kim is here because he chaired a joint project conducted by ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research that was aimed at broadening eligibility criteria for cancer clinical trials. And the result of this was a set of comprehensive recommendations that we published as a special series in the Journal of Clinical Oncology just last year. So, Dr. Kim, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Cliff. It's my pleasure to be here today.
So I want to kick this off with a little discussion around the basics. The whole science of clinical research and clinical trials is relatively new when one imagines the history of science as a whole. Can you give our listeners just a brief introduction into the concept of eligibility criteria? Why do we have them? What is the original purpose in having eligibility criteria for clinical trials?
From a young standpoint to what I was in my younger years and learning how to write clinical trials, we know that all of these new drugs that we hear about on the news or hear about them in research, they all had to come from clinical trials. And it starts in the early phase setting and progresses through phase 2, phase 3, and finally after a randomized study that shows a survival benefit or one of the parameters of benefit, the FDA approves the drug. And so in order to test a drug, to see if it is worthy and better than the existing standard therapies, or creating a new standard of therapy, we want to make sure to control a lot of variables. We know that each person, individual, has different things that affect them. Some of them are physical, some of them are mental, some of them are disease-related, some of them deal with certain organs that they might have issues with, some previous health problems. And so in order for a clinical trial to give the drug, the testing drug, the best shot, it's important to try and set up some parameters to try and test a population of patients that in fact will be representative and allow that the effectiveness of that drug to be demonstrated. What does that mean in real world terms? If we enroll patients into trials who are really sick, or who have damaged hearts or lung function or kidneys, then we might not be giving the drug a fair representation of its effectiveness because of the different medical issues of the patient population. So that's why you sort of hear some of the anecdotes out there or quips that are, well, in order to be on a clinical trial, you have to be a triathlete or very fit. And that's not what we want either, because that is also not representative of that real world patient who's battling cancer. And so the eligibility criteria established these sort of parameters in which a patient could enroll into a clinical trial and those who would not be eligible based on these factors. And those factors usually come from basic things such as you have to have the histology of the actual cancer. Makes sense. It should be in the same stage. Some trials test early stage, some test later stage. It also needs to include performance status. And performance status can be sort of a somewhat subjective marker. It really is a functional assessment on how someone is able to perform daily activities and that they're out of bed. And so generally we have guidance around that. And then they look at organs and see how your blood work looks. Make sure you're not severely anemic, or your liver is functioning well, your kidneys and your heart. And so all of these things go into eligibility criteria. And then there's drug-specific eligibility criteria. What does that mean? It means that certain drugs that are being tested within the clinical research also have certain contradictions or interactions, and so there are criteria that are associated with that as well. As we study single drugs, combination drugs, and continue to study even more sophisticated things like biomarkers, where even now, instead of just histology, sometimes we have to test a patient's tissue to actually see if there is a certain presence of a marker in the tumor that makes the eligibility for the study. And so we've seen this over time change from the 80s and 90s up to now modern day, where the eligibility criteria have some largely stayed the same, and others have really been added on. But the primary purpose is to find a population that is consistent, that allows us to interpret the true effect of a drug or intervention, and thus, for the greater good, get it FDA approved so that patients outside of the clinical trial can also experience those benefits.
Well, I think that's a really clear understanding of at least part of the challenge we face, because on the one hand, we never want to miss the opportunity to identify the beneficial effects of a drug, and in some cases, selecting the wrong patient population, as you point out, might limit our observation. But it raises what has become a very topical issue, often labeled real-world evidence, but it speaks to the fact that in most of the circumstances that we see, the real-world impact of a given approved drug is often measured as less than what was reported in the clinical trials. And I myself have made that triathlete quip on more than one occasion, so I guess I'm guilty of that as well. I think we'll come back to that a little bit, but I wanted to raise a couple of other issues. You mentioned, rightly, I think, a few of the classic examples of eligibility criteria. What about things like patient age or very specific prior therapeutic exposures? That seems to be two areas where there's been some change in the last few years.
Yeah, these are issues that I have to be very honest. When I first started learning how to write protocols, they were present in every protocol I read. And I do adult oncology, so it said that patients had to be greater than the age of 18. So just like how when you're growing up and you can get your driver's permit at 15 and you can get your license at 16, and alcohol ages can vary in different states. You kind of accepted that. Oh, okay, 18, that's an adult, seems right when you go to college, so makes sense, that's when you're an adult. And as far as the age ceiling, per se, again, I didn't get to see too many that excluded people who were older, but we noticed that based on all the other eligibility criteria that included cardiovascular disease, diabetes, some other comorbid conditions, well, that happens to our older population. And so maybe unknowingly, we don't really get to enroll many patients who are older, especially above the age of 70, because of these competing eligibility criteria. And it's sort of like that unknown bias, I think, that occurs, that we're not really thinking about that. And when we go back and look at data, we see that maybe we're not enrolling these older patients. So that is certainly an issue. Another one that you mentioned, prior cancers, also is another issue. If a patient has had a prior cancer, sometimes within 5 years, sometimes within 3 years, that you're not allowed to enroll that patient because, again, that could be a confounding sort of aspect. And even taking that a step further, patients who are being treated for a current cancer, certainly many of those patients are excluded. And it makes you scratch your head sometime because Some patients are treated with curative intent therapy. You're an expert in breast cancer, and we know that we give hormonal therapy to these women for a long time, 5 to 10 years at times, and certainly different cancers can crop up during that time, and not sure if that's a patient who should be excluded just because they're on treatment, but those are the challenges that certainly exist of having available drugs, having cancer, and eligibility criteria where they can intersect.
And, we touched on this, but one of the challenges that's frequently cited in our world is the low level of participation in clinical research. And a common statistic is that it's around 3% of adults with solid tumors enroll on clinical trials. Do you think that these eligibility criteria, appropriate or not, represent a significant cause of that low level of accrual, or do you think it's mostly other factors anyway?
It is really a travesty that the percentage is that low, and I've heard similar numbers as you have, 3 to 5%. Certainly there are some high functioning groups that are in the 15 to 20% range, and we know that it's not a shortage of clinical trials. We certainly all get the notices from whatever agency or company that our enrollment is slow, and that we have to fill out forms to justify why we should continue to keep a trial open. And that's really the ironic part is that it's sort of this trickle-down effect of work. You're trying to first write a protocol so you can give opportunity to a patient population to test the disease with a new drug or a change in drug. Most of the patients that you see are not going to be eligible. And because your accrual doesn't go as fast as you'd like to, that either leads to more paperwork or a whole series of more paperwork that's required to do this. And so I agree with you. The eligibility criteria is certainly, I think, a major component of why we cannot get patients onto clinical trials. And certainly there are many ramifications of that we'll discuss in this podcast, but I think you have to start with the obvious factors first. We've all tried to use education and awareness to notify people that, there are clinical trials available, and you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and find the trial that's right for you and the center that has it close to you, and put these maps out there to match people to trials. But that does not take into account eligibility criteria. And, it may be present, it may be near you. You may think you're a candidate, but until you go through the 30 to 50 eligibility criteria in most protocols, that's not the case.
Well, this is probably a great hint that we could pivot to solutions rather than just describing the challenges. And one of the ways in which we've tried to do that is by convening a project on broadening eligibility criteria. We did that with Friends of Cancer Research, and you were obviously a leader in that program. So can you describe a little bit about this project, which began in 2016, and just what it was that you sought to achieve, and where you think we are now?
Yeah, and I might take it back even a little bit further into 2012 when the ASCO blueprint came out. And one of the things mentioned in the blueprint was modernizing eligibility criteria. It's something that ASCO had identified very early on as a priority, and there had not been many publications or even a lot of chatter, I'll use that word these days, about it. And so I was tasked with this back then when I was a member of the Cancer Research Committee at ASCO. And we formed a small working group, multidisciplinary, and went to get some real data. Again, it's fine to write papers that are editorials or speculative or ideations, but if you can have some data, that'd be really important. And we did about this looking at multiple different areas. We worked with industry to look at trials and accrual rates based on eligibility criteria. We looked at our own trials here from the cooperative group settings and the number of eligibility at Levine Cancer Institute. We polled the Vail faculty as well as looked at clinicaltrials.gov. And we got some answers and we couldn't find with others. And we published those results in 2015 in JCO. And there were many groups that were also concerned about eligibility criteria, and Friends of Cancer Research saw this publication and was very interested in partnering with ASCO about this. And so we were ecstatic that they were equally passionate and excited about this topic. And so we convened a meeting with them, and we created the criteria that we would start with first. You can't boil the ocean in one day, and so we narrowed it down to sort of 4 or 5 criteria that we grouped into working groups. We set up multidisciplinary groups with leads. We had patient advocates, clinical investigators, FDA medical reviewers, drug and biotech manufacturers, biostatisticians, and pharmacologists. And we convened these groups, so after that, once they were given their assignments, we had monthly meetings with all the groups. So this is where I had spent a lot of time working with them. We templated out how we wanted the structure of these groups to be and how we were going to report them. And to your point, Cliff, again, not just stating opinions and stating recommendations, but also even templating out what is the wording that needs to go into the actual protocol. We need to make this practical. We need to take this as a first step. And so that's the history. And Friends of Cancer Research has been a really fantastic partner in this. They're such a great advocacy organization.
So just to get into the weeds a little bit for a moment, my recollection is that you identified with the group 5 areas where you thought eligibility criteria could be specifically expanded, where the bar to entry could be lowered. Do you want to talk about what those are and why they were chosen?
Yeah, that'd be great. And so, again, as an initial step, we knew we weren't going to transform eligibility criteria overnight. It had been probably maybe 60 or 100 years based on what's been adding up over time. But we wanted to take a first step, but a significant step. And so the ones we chose first was patients who have brain metastases. Now, this has already begun to start changing, but we felt it was very important to reinforce this, that, look, the real world is there is a good number of patients, 20 to 30%, who show up that have brain disease and brain metastases. And for many years, they were automatically excluded from clinical trials because the thought is that their overall prognosis was worse. I think there's been enough data out there to show that isn't necessarily the case in all tumor types, and many drugs these days actually have very good penetration into the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, or through the blood-brain barrier. And so that was one of the first areas that we targeted, was brain metastases, again, to try and see how we could include these patients who present with them in clinical trials. HIV was the next criteria, and that was one that, again, seems kind of obvious. I remember when I was in medical school, this was a huge new issue, and people were concerned with people at HIV. How contagious is it? Would one be affected? I even had classmates in medical school that stated in a class that they would not treat patients who had HIV. And again, I think that was a lot of fear that was based. We know that that's changed quite a bit now. And one of the criteria that you'll usually see in protocols is any history of HIV is not allowed. Now, what's always ironic about that, and I found as an investigator, is that we would never test or screen for HIV in a blood test for a patient. So if they said something, or you guided it through the history, then they would be excluded. What we've seen in the technology and the advances in HIV and antiretrovirals is that patients with HIV are living just as equally as to the general population. And so this was one that seemed to be antiquated and definitely needed to be changed, yet was always in every clinical trial that came up. Minimum age was another area that we looked at. What is it about this magic number of 18 that is the number for patients? And again, there's been work prior to look at the elderly population, but what about that population? Why is it that a 15 or 16-year-old, and yeah, they have a driver's permit or a license, who has a sarcoma that didn't respond well to standard therapy, cannot have access to a trial that has one of these newer agents involved because they're classified in the pediatric sense? And so that was one that we really wanted to tackle as well, and try and redefine what that age should be to be included in adult clinical trials or young person clinical trials. And then we also had organ dysfunction and prior malignancies. Organ dysfunction, mostly focusing on the liver and the kidneys. Again, these are organs that do have quite a bit of reserve, but there are quite a few exclusion criteria within these protocols that don't allow patients who have some deficits in these, and sometimes that's independent of whether the drug really even is metabolized or excreted through the respective organs. So being a little more specific there on the actual drug being tested, the actual dysfunction, and how we're measuring it in patients, we thought would be very important. And then, as discussed before, the concurrent malignancies. My gosh, if you've had a stage 1 prostate cancer that is being treated, or a stage 1 breast cancer, or 2 that's being on hormonal therapy, and why should we be excluding those patients who have maybe a higher clear and present danger with a new cancer that may have occurred just because they've had prior cancer? And so these were the criteria that we focused on.
So, the 3 core values at ASCO are evidence, care, and impact. And you've described an examination of the evidence and care for patients. But I want to focus for just a moment on impact. Can you describe, what steps have been taken to actually convert this thoughtful position and analysis into action so that we have an impact? What has been done? Are we depending on voluntary loosening or modernizing of eligibility criteria, or is there something more that we're able to do as a coalition with, for example, the FDA or manufacturers or others?
Yeah, that's a great point, Cliff, and I think that's a really important core mission of ASCO. Someone like Rich Shilsky, for instance, this Chief Medical Officer, has been really pivotal in helping us with this impact and effect. One very practical example that is really in the real world and is showing that this is all very feasible is the ASCO TAPER study. Dr. Shilsky has been very proactive in adopting many of these eligibility criteria sort of changes, and we've been able to demonstrate an example of a trial that is being done, is enrolling at a record pace, and it incorporates these very eligibility criteria that we've outlined in the JCO series. And I think that's why we haven't moved to additional criteria, because I will tell you, after we published these papers from all these working groups, and Stuart Lichtman, who led organ dysfunction, and Leah Gore, who headed up minimum age, Thomas Ulrich, who headed up HIV, and Nancy Lin with brain metastases, their hard work has really paid off in having a lot more interest generated about eligibility criteria. People are coming to me saying, okay, well, what about this one next and this one? I'm like, well, we'll get there. We wanted to, though, make an impact and make some change. We stated to people that this was going to be about culture shift. It wasn't going to be about just changing up some eligibility criteria. At the end of the day, I want the new generation of clinicians who are seeing patients with clinical trials not to think, oh, the patient has brain disease, brain metastases, they're probably not eligible, but let me check. I want it to be every patient is eligible, and the exception is this one little thing as to why they have brain metastases. Maybe it's leptomeningeal disease. That's why. So it needs to be more of the half glass full, and then we find out what these criteria are eliminating people from trials, and not a half empty standpoint. And that's the culture shift that we're trying. That first started with, frankly, the ASCO Cancer Research Committee, getting people to buy in, and they did. And ASCO has been really supportive. Friends of Cancer Research, I think, added a ton of energy to this, and they certainly have a lot of ties to industry with the FDA. We brought in all of these folks as stakeholders. So what's been really great is industry has been cooperative because we've had them in the room as well as FDA. Rick Pazder has been very instrumental in saying, we're okay with expanding eligibility and the eligible populations in even early phase testing. And there have been biostatisticians have outlined designs that would allow industry or groups to study these populations. And if there is excessive toxicity, not have that interfere with their drug development process in a different population. So there have been solutions offered, and I think these have been very well received. We've also been working with NIH, NCI, and there are changes coming forward in the CTEP template, the protocol template, which we're excited about. This should happen by the end of the summer, and new language will be inserted into the templates that now the newer generation and the new protocols that come out will have these. Monica Bertinelli who's also a major player in Alliance, has been very supportive. They invited ASCO to present at their clinical leads meeting and outline the eligibility criteria. There's a lot of support. Again, I love it when the questions come up as, all right, well, what about this one? Did you consider this one or that criteria? That means people want more. And that's really, I think, the change we're looking for and the impact. And so we even have now in the VAIL courses and the International Methods in Clinical Cancer Research course, lectures that will be talking about eligibility criteria, because this is a workshop specifically to write clinical trials and to help with that. So I think from many aspects, we're seeing support. We're seeing there be increasing groundswell. The number of publications that have come out on eligibility criteria have been actually several-fold higher in the last 3 years than the prior 2 decades combined. And so we love the fact that there is conversation going on, that people see that this is an opportunity where we can make change. And I think through ASCO's perseverance, as well as with Friends of Cancer Research's help, and engaging the right partners in industry, with the FDA, with the government, we have made those steps. And I think changing the templates is a huge deal. And I think that will just lead to further steps that we can move forward with the next set of criteria that we decide on.
So it sounds like it's fair to say that this is just beginning to be felt at the clinical interface, reflecting a whole lot of work and thoughtfulness before. But in the years ahead, many of our participants and listeners will see clinical trials written in a way that reflects this new modernized view. And I think you're to be congratulated for that. So with that, I just want to say again to you, Dr. Kim, thanks once more for joining us here today for this ASCO in Action podcast episode. I want to remind everybody that ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research will continue to work to implement the recommendations as Dr. Kim has described. They will also be identifying additional opportunities, like you just heard, to safely expand eligibility criteria and make trials more inclusive. I really like the image you had of the glass half full rather than half empty, that the question is not, is my patient eligible, but really, why wouldn't my patient be eligible? For everybody interested in learning more, you can access the JCO special series on broadening eligibility criteria for cancer clinical trials on our website at the JCO. You can also learn more about eligibility criteria on ASCO.org. We have information for patients in terms of clinical trial participation and eligibility, which is appropriate and aimed clearly at patients on cancer.net. And so with that, I want to thank you again, Dr. Kim, and until next time, for all of you listening, thanks for tuning in to hear this ASCO in Action podcast.